Hello everyone, Andrew Baskin here, partner at Lyft Economy. A quick announcement before today's show. Lyft Economy is proud to be co-hosting the Dismantling White Supremacy Unconference on June 14th and 15th at Impact Hub Oakland. The goal of this unconference is to provide a space for people of color and white allies, including activists, policymakers, business leaders, and more, to have an explicit and courageous conversation about dismantling systemic white supremacy and the many discussions that come up around white supremacy in a community-led forum. Visit www.dismantlecollective.org to learn more and to register for this exciting event. Get your tickets today before the event sells out. And lastly, a quick shout out for those who might be interested in our upcoming Next Economy MBA online course. You can use promo code #NextEconomyNow to get a 15% discount. Seats are filling up, so claim your spot today. And now, on with the show. Welcome to Next Economy Now. I'm your host, Andrew Baskin. The goal of this interview series is to highlight the leaders who are taking a regenerative, bioregional, democratic, diverse, transparent, and whole systems approach to using business as a force for good.
This is the way white supremacy principally operates, is by, making that which is really quite particular seem as if it's universal. This is what Afrocentric scholars like Molefi Asante call like the hallmark of Eurocentrism, is universalizing the particular. For a lot of white folks, for instance, I think this idea that, the workday is supposed to be these hours from this to this, and you're supposed to, be this productive, and you're supposed to, meet this particular deadline, and you're supposed to do this particular, and you're supposed to dress a certain way at work, and this is what professional attire looks like, and this is all of these things, which may or may not be valid. I mean, they may or may not be good things, or they may be a mixed bag, but the idea that, everybody just knows that this is the way you do business, this is the way you do work. Well, in other cultures around the world, it's not necessarily the case. In other cultures around the world, both attire and the way the workday is structured and the way the work product is done is very, very different.
In this episode of Next Economy Now, Ryan Honeyman, a partner at Lyft Economy, interviews Tim Wise. Tim is an activist, public speaker, and among the most prominent anti-racist writers and educators in the U.S. He spent the past 25 years speaking to audiences in all 50 states, on over 1,000 colleges and high school campuses, and hundreds of professional and academic conferences, and to community groups across the country. He's also host of the new podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise. Tim is the author of 7 books, including his latest, Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America. So without further ado, please enjoy Ryan Honeyman's conversation with Tim Wise.
Tim, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So Tim, I did read your book, White Like Me, so you do have a whole book about this, but for listeners who haven't read it, how did you first get into the type of work you're doing today?
Well, I guess I got into the kind of work that I do today while I was in college, and then after I graduated. I should back up, though, because I think part of how I got even to that had a lot to do with my upbringing. So I'm born and reared in the South. I've lived in the South all my life, born and raised in Nashville, Tennessee. Ultimately went to college in New Orleans and was born in 1968, grew up in the 70s, and graduated from high school in the mid 80s. And growing up, I was growing up at a very particular time in Nashville history, and I mean, really American history, but Nashville history, where the schools were really for the first time being desegregated. 20 years after Brown v. Board, when I started first grade, is really the first year that the elementary schools in Nashville were fully desegregated. So I was the beneficiary of this push for integrated, more equitable education, though it wasn't, as equitable as it should have been. It certainly was integrated, and it was important, I think, and valuable in a lot of ways, because it, in many instances, forced me to not always take my normalcy for granted, my sort of my whiteness as a given thing. I'd actually gone to preschool at a historically black college on the other side of town from where I grew up, at Tennessee State University, where I definitely was not the norm. I was one of a handful of white kids in a class full of black kids and mostly black teachers. And I think why that was important was like twofold. One was that the authority figures were mostly black women, so I was learning to respect black authority at the age of 3 and 4, at a time when very few white folks ever have to respect black authority or be subordinated to it. And then secondly, I was sort of enmeshed in a culture of blackness that meant that when I got to elementary school and I saw black friends and black kids I identified with being treated differently, disciplined more harshly, put in remedial level classes, even though they were just as bright, it bothered me. I didn't know that it was racism. And it's not like I went home and told my mom at the age of 5, like, holy shit, you won't believe the institutional white supremacy in Burton Elementary School. But it was obvious to me something was happening, and it was separating me from my friends, and it was having an effect on me. And so I had this consciousness, I think, in the back of my mind for a long time. It didn't really get activated, though, in a big way until I went to college in New Orleans. And I think, being in a place like that, which is one of the most racially divided cities in a highly racially divided country, and going to a school like Tulane University uptown in New Orleans, which is such a contrast in terms of economics and finances and everything from the larger city, and such a difference culturally too. I mean, New Orleans is a black city in every way, shape, and form historically, but Tulane is really not, And so it was just, some things were very apparent to me, and that was the 80s, and we were all, a lot of us who were activists were doing anti-apartheid work, but specifically about apartheid in South Africa. And I was very fortunate to have some mentors and people I met in the community who were kind enough to sort of take me aside and tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, it's really great that you're worried about white supremacy in South Africa. Can we have a little talk about the shit that's going on down the street? Because you might want to focus on that a little. And, having those folks really as mentors and teachers and people to help me through the process was really critical. And then when I got out of college, of course, it was 1990, and it was the year David Duke, former Klan leader, white supremacist, modern Nazi, was running for the United States Senate and then governor of Louisiana in 91. So I was involved in the campaigns to defeat him. And that was really how I got my start. But I think it goes back to some of those childhood upbringing influences, and then also just the stark contrast between a place like Tulane and the city where it happens to be located.
Yeah, and it was great to read that, because my mom's side is from New Orleans, and they live in Uptown, and my memories of going to New Orleans, it's pretty white. It's by Audubon Park.
Yeah, right.
And walking past Tulane, and it's been interesting in the last few years with this developing anti-racist understanding of New Orleans, what it meant to the entire system of slavery, and being the hub for a lot of selling of slaves, et cetera. So
absolutely.
It was
Yeah, and that's the shit they don't tell you. They don't tell a lot of white folks growing up there that. They don't really tell you that when you get to Tulane either. I mean, it wasn't as if we got there and we got this really good primer on where we're at and what it means. I had to learn that from people in the community, because that wasn't really, it ought to be something they talk about. It seems like it ought to be, a welcome to New Orleans and here's the deal kind of class that everybody ought to have to take. But man, it's not how it works. And of course, that's not just New Orleans. That's true everywhere. We never talk about the painful histories of where we are. So that's a bigger problem, I guess, for the country.
I think it dovetails a little bit with my next question around, how do you see, you actually wrote a Medium article that just posted today around, the idea of in search of honest racists. I'd rather have people just say I'm racist, than, in the Bay Area, we have people who say they're not racist, but are actually perpetuating white supremacy. What do you see? What are you seeing around progressive white folks and the blind spots they have about perpetuating white supremacy?
Right. Well, some of this has to do with the way we teach history. So as a Southerner, I'm very attuned to the fact that, the winners get to write the narratives. And I'm glad the South lost the Civil War, make no mistake. Because I know what it was about. It was most certainly about maintaining the system of chattel enslavement. However, the North and those who were not Southern had a real interest ideologically in rewriting themselves a bit in that history and casting anyone who wasn't Southern as being like the good whites, as opposed to the Southern whites who were the bad whites. And the problem with that, of course, is that white supremacy was a national phenomenon. Yeah, white folks were fighting to preserve their particular version of it. But it's not as if those in the North were fighting to eradicate all versions of it. They just didn't want this particular one. And Dr. King went to Chicago and said it was the most racist place he'd ever tried to organize. We know what happened in Boston in 74 and 75 with the integration crisis there and the white racist reaction to busing. And, all throughout the West Coast. I mean, I've been going to the West Coast for this work for over a quarter century. And I remember the first time I went out, it was 1996. It was 1995, actually. He was in the beginning stages of the Prop 209 battle, the battle to end affirmative action in the state of California. It was after Prop 187 had passed, which was the anti-immigrant legislation or initiative in 94. And I remember people in the Bay Area, they were saying like, well, what are you doing here? Why aren't you back in the South where the problem is? And I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, we're not passing this shit. This is y'all. I'm just trying to help. I'm just trying to pay it forward, man. I appreciate y'all coming to the South 40, 50 years ago. I'm just coming here because it seems like y'all need a little help. And I think there's a conceit that white progressives have been able to adopt just because they're not Southern. The problem with that, in addition to how historically dishonest it is that it also ignores the fact that if you're a progressive person who comes up not in the South, you're very likely to not have a racial lens for the work that you do. Whereas if you are someone who comes up in the South and you're white and you still end up progressive, because let's be honest, the South is certainly a more conservative region politically, yes. But if you grow up here and you end up liberal or progressive in spite of growing up here, I guarantee you that the lens through which you see everything is going to be about race. On the other hand, if I grew up white in Burlington, Vermont, if I grew up white in Portland, if I grew up white in San Francisco or in Marin County, or if I grow up in Seattle, it's very possible. Yeah, I'm probably more likely statistically to end up progressive on a whole host of issues, but it's also very likely that I won't understand the centrality of race to what's going on, because unlike the South, where everything has always been about race and we know it is, other people have the luxury of not thinking that. And I remember being a little shocked, I'll be honest, when I went to these places that I sort of fetishized as these progressive havens. The Bay Area was one of them. I was stunned by how much racism I saw, how much inequality I saw. I remember going to Portland one of the first times I went there and thinking, Portland, that's like, progressive nirvana. And having this black kid who had brought me into the college where I was going to be speaking that night, he was one of the organizers of the event, driving me around and picked me up at the airport. And he's taking me to my hotel. I think he was a junior at this college at the time. And he asked me, he said, how many times do you think I've been stopped by police since I've lived here? He was not from there, but he moved there and he brought his car with him, I guess, his sophomore year. So he'd had his car for like a year and a half or so. How many times do you think I've been stopped? I said, I don't know. He said like 57 times or something outrageous. And I said, well, how many times did you actually get a ticket? And he said, not once, right? And that tells you a lot. Now, I'm sure the people who deny racism would say, oh, see, they just gave him warnings. They're not racist. But what the hell? You get stopped 57 times, you never get a ticket. It's because you ain't done anything, right? That's why you didn't get a ticket. So nonetheless, he was being stopped as a form of like petty harassment. And they wanted to, maybe find something, smell weed or something and have a way to bust him. They couldn't do it because he hadn't done anything. That's the kind of racism that I think, for some people, it's less obvious, it's less blatant. But if you're the person who's targeted by it, it's not less obvious. It's just wrapped with dishonesty. So the point of the piece that I wrote that, like you said, came out today is just to say, look, man, just, at least I know where I stand when I'm in Birmingham. At least I know where I stand when I'm, outside of Atlanta in some mostly white suburb. At least I know where I stand, or even in Atlanta for that matter, with certain white folks in law enforcement and elsewhere. At least I know the deal. But if I'm out in these other areas where everybody's so wrapped up in the fact that they vote for Democrats or whatever, then it's real easy for them to miss, the way that they contribute to that problem and the kind of experiences that Black and brown folks are having every day, even in those places which are ostensibly more progressive. Yeah,
and I think the biggest shift for me came when I saw, there's a list, I think it was the Dismantling Racism Works, where like Tim Okun and several others put together the dominant white culture values. So things like, there's one right way, either or. There's only like, you're either one way or the other. There's emotional restraint. There's sense of urgency. Like I think many progressive white people don't see like, oh, my urgency during the day is actually part of a white supremacist culture and like creating negative outcomes. Can you speak a little bit to those like habits and norms that are so deeply a part of us that we don't even see them?
Yeah, well, I mean, like for instance, and I know the list that Tima and others have used, and I think it's a really helpful way of understanding culture, which is a word we use a lot, but we don't define very much, or we don't really conceptualize or interrogate. And I think a lot of the stuff that we do, this is the way white supremacy principally operates, is by, making that which is really quite particular seem as if it's universal. This is what Afrocentric scholars like Molefi Asante call like the hallmark of Eurocentrism, is universalizing the particular, right? So for a lot of white folks, for instance, I think this idea that, well, the workday is supposed to be these hours from this to this, and you're supposed to, be this productive, and you're supposed to, meet this particular deadline, and you're supposed to do this particular, and you're supposed to dress a certain way at work, and this is what professional attire looks like, and this is all of these things, which may or may not be valid. I mean, they may or may not be good things, or they may be a mixed bag, but the idea that, well, everybody just knows that this is the way you do business, this is the way you do work. Well, in other cultures around the world, it's not necessarily the case. In other cultures around the world, both attire and the way the workday is structured and the way that work product is done is very, very different. And so the norms that we take for granted are not universal. They're not just normal. They're ours. They may or may not be good. They may or may not be things that are helpful, but they are certainly white, and they're also middle class, and they're all of those things. And one of the things that I learned as a community organizer, where this becomes a real problem, because it's not just an abstract thing, is when I was a community organizer, I was working in communities in New Orleans that were low-income communities, public housing communities often. And a lot of times you would have these white, progressive foundations, right, that would come in with money, and they were willing to, spend some dough in those places for good purposes. They were willing to put money into, programs to help create jobs and teen pregnancy prevention, HIV/AIDS prevention. There was a funding for this thing called it's like a Manhood Initiative, where it was talking about dealing with issues of toxic masculinity and creating positive images of masculinity in the Black community and low income spaces. And so, I mean, it's good stuff, but what was interesting was a lot of times these funders come in and, most of the time, like foundations, progressive foundations, like any foundation that's giving grant money, they have a very particularistic conception of what progress looks like. And they have a very particular conception of the time frame allowed to see that progress in order for the grant to be renewed, right? So a lot of times it's a 3-year time frame, maybe a 5-year time frame. The problem is, if I'm living in that community, if I'm a low-income, working-class, struggling Black person living in New Orleans, and you come into my community with a big bucket of money, and I've never met you. I don't know who you are. I know nothing about you. All I know is you don't live in my neighborhood. You don't come around. Now you want to come give me some dough so you can study me and so you can create something that's supposedly going to help me. There's a lack of trust, right? Because there's a lack of human connection between the funders who live in New York or in DC or wherever they live and the people being funded. And so a lot of times, if you're on a 3-year time frame, which is seen as, well, this is just the way we do it. This is the normal amount of time that we give for the progress to happen. Well, that's a very white, middle to upper middle class norm, because that community, because they don't know who you are, they don't trust you, they don't know what you're doing in their space, it may take 3 years or at least, 2 years to even get to where they are willing to talk with you or really sit down and be honest with you, because they're going to be very guarded almost by definition for a while. So if you're on a 3-year time frame for a grant and it takes 2 years to build trust, by the 3rd year, it's very possible that that community has not seen whatever the measure was for success. If it's reducing violence or reducing teen pregnancy or whatever, you may not get the goal that was set out, because it's going to take 2 to 3 years just to get over the hump of mistrust. Now, if you had a 5 to 10 year time frame that you were willing to fund, and you were willing to actually build with the people in that space and let them influence the way that you do your work, now you might actually have something. But the white middle class sort of expectations and norms that we take for granted make it really hard to do that. And so this ends up getting in the way of progress and stymieing even the really well-intended efforts of white liberals and progressives in many cases.
Yeah, this is a bit of a personal question related to my company, Lift Economy, but it's also, I think, relevant to many listeners who are in organizations. It's related to what you just said around, how do you most effectively, help is not the right word, because that's the savior complex. So one of the things we've been trying to do is, at our 6-person company, it's 4 white people and 2 Black individuals. So it's still white majority, but we've been trying to come to this idea around, what does it mean to center low-income communities of color in everything we do, rather than just there's a program or like a consulting agreement that's sort of like a one-off. Right. And I'm curious, how do you see organizations, like, what does it mean to center low-income communities of color in everything they do? And like, what advice would you give to companies that are potentially trying to do that?
Well, I think the first thing is there's got to be an exploratory period where someone who wants to do work, whether that is nonprofit work, for-profit work, a company, a NGO or nonprofit organization, whatever it is, before you start anything, it's about going to the space where you're thinking of locating and operating and getting to know some of the community leaders, and being very transparent with them and just really listening to what are their needs. I think one of the problems is that people who don't live in those spaces, sometimes we think we know what their needs are because they seem glaringly obvious. So you might say, oh, well, in this particular space, they need jobs because there's really high unemployment. Or in this particular space, they need better schools because the schools don't have the infrastructure and the resources they need. And you might be 100% correct that that's what's needed. But the people in that space want to know that they are the ones who were creating from the ground up whatever those schools are going to look like, whatever those job opportunities are going to look like, whatever those nonprofit efforts are going to look like. So rather than like having the model, going to the space, opening up shop, saying we're here and we want to include you, which is like, come into the dance, with your own idea of what the dance needs to look like and your own playlist and your own DJ and your own music, and then saying, hey, but if y'all want to dance to our shit, feel free. Like, we've got this great DJ and a really good playlist and y'all are totally welcome to come to the dance. That's very different from being in the community, getting to know people and saying, hey, what tunes do y'all want to play, metaphorically speaking, right? And I see a lot of the problem here, not just with like businesses or nonprofits. You see it I work with a lot of colleges around their service learning or community service efforts, right? Because all these schools, it's not just colleges, sometimes it's also high schools that, push this idea of doing service in the community. And sometimes it's really charity-based rather than solidarity-based, which is a huge problem. One of the biggest problems with some of the service learning efforts is that rarely do I find a school that is starting out by asking the community, just the most basic, simple asking of the community, what do y'all need? Like, what is it that y'all actually need from us? Because number one, they might say nothing. And if so, centering them means, all right, well, I'm not going where I'm not asked in, where I'm not wanted. That's just basic community organizing principle that anyone who's ever been an organizer learns. You go where you're asked to go and you don't go where you're not asked to go. But if you ask the question, you might find out that community has very different needs. And some of the needs they have are incredibly basic. So one of the stories I tell in White Like Me, but it's worth repeating, is, that when I started doing organizing, I go into the community, I've got a head full of steam. I think I know what they need. Now, I was asked in and I was working with someone who lived in the community. So I had a reason to be there and it was proper for me to be there. But I went in with a particular idea of what the struggles were. And when I asked one of the guys who'd been organizing there as a resident in that community for a long time, what are y'all working on? His answer was, we're trying to get a stop sign or a stoplight, one or the other, at that four-way stop right there. And he pointed to the four-way stop. And I was like, wait, what? A stop sign? What the hell? Like, I thought we were fighting white supremacy and capitalism and all these other things, right? And he says, yeah, that's all good, but we need a stoplight because, first of all, people are getting hit on their bikes. So kids are getting hit. So we need some kind of way to stop that from happening. But also because we can win the stoplight or the stop sign, whichever it was. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, if we fight for that, man, we can go to the council. Isn't that big a deal? We can raise that issue. We can push for it. And there's no real reason for them not to give it to us so we can win that. And then what that does is it lets the community know that they have more power than they think. It gives them a sense of what it means to win, to take on the powers that be and win. And then all of a sudden they get a sense that, all right, well, shit, if we won that one, what's the next step? And then what's the next step? And so some of the times centering the community means starting off with some really basic needs that are not necessarily revolutionary and transformative at first, but which over time build capacity. And that means you have to be prepared to listen to those folks. And in order to listen to them, you got to get to know them. And you have to get to know them as much on a plane of equity as possible, which oftentimes doesn't exist.
You had another great story in White Like Me that dovetails with this around, I think you were doing a speech in Chicago at a university. And yeah. I think you probably already know this, what I'm going, but you're basically speaking about, the work you're doing. And there's an African-American woman student in the back who's kind of rolling her eyes and saying like, yeah. whatever. Yeah. And she was kind of saying, and actually you could probably tell the story because it happened to you. And I'm sort of But yeah.
So this is actually the first speech that I ever gave on the road when I got out on the so-called lecture circuit. It was March of '95, and it was at Northeastern Illinois University in Chicago. And I was brought in by a sociology professor there to speak to some classes. It wasn't even like a campus-wide thing. I mean, I was totally an unknown quantity for most folks. And so I go into the class, and yeah, I'm giving this talk, and there's the black woman in the back of the room, young woman who just like the look on her face was like, whatever, man, I'm not here for this bullshit, and whoever the hell you are. And, you know, because I was only a couple years older than these students. So I'm sure it was like, not just that I'm a white guy, but like I'm like 27 and she's probably 22. And she's probably sitting there like, why in the hell am I listening to this dude? And there was a young white woman, the other part of the story, right? There's a young white woman who said at one point, you know, I really am impressed by all the work that you're doing, and I'd really love to do that kind of work, but I'm afraid that black people won't trust me and they won't like me, and how do you deal with that? And she said, you know, do you think black people like you and trust you? And I'm like, I don't know. You'd have to ask black folks. Like, I'm sure there are some who do. The ones that I've worked with in New Orleans, I think we got a pretty good relationship. But I said, you know, quite certain there are some who don't. And I saw this young woman in the back of the room. She was clearly on the no, I don't side of that. And so I thought, well, this will be perfect. So I called on her because she had her hand up. And she said, well, make no mistake, we don't like you, and we sure as hell don't trust you, or something like that. And this young white woman who was sitting in the front row, she just like damn near came unglued, right? She was like, oh my God, see, that's what I'm talking about. Like, they don't even trust you and you're trying so hard. But it didn't really faze me because, first of all, why would this young woman trust me? She doesn't know me. She's a young woman from Chicago with a long history in that community of institutionalized white supremacy. I doubt she has ever had any reason to trust this 27-year-old white man in her life. Now, do I wish that she would trust me? Of course, everybody would like to be believed and trusted and, you know, take it for granted that I'm a good guy, but that's not the real world, right? The real world is that people like me have really never probably shown up in real solidarity with her. And so my response to her was, well, you know, on the one hand, I'm really sorry to hear that because we don't know each other, but, you know, I get it. I totally understand. And I said, you know, the bottom line, and I just want you to understand this, and it wasn't really aimed at her so much as it was the whole class, is I'm not really doing this for you. And it sort of took class by shock a little bit. I think people were sort of like, whoa, what did he just say? I didn't mean it, you know, disrespectfully. I think maybe some people thought it was like, screw you, I'm not doing this for you. That's not what I meant. What I then went on to explain was, I don't fight white supremacy so I can save you and other black people from it. To me, that's very missionary. It's very charity-based. It's very much about that savior complex stuff. For me, I fight white supremacy because I fundamentally believe white supremacy is poison to the planet. I really fundamentally believe that white supremacy is at the root of militarism. I think white supremacy is at the root of resource exploitation. I think white supremacy is at the root of economic inequality. And I think in the long run, white supremacy ends up being dangerous for the vast majority of all people, including people called white. And one can either agree or disagree with that, but at least if you understand that's where I'm coming from, you'll understand, like, this is not charity. This is not trying to save other people. This is about trying to protect myself and one day my children. I obviously didn't have children yet at that point. I do now. It's about saving, frankly, my people. It's pretty selfish, you know, and it's no different than the motivation that people of color have for fighting white supremacy, which is to save themselves. They ain't doing it for charity. They ain't doing it for altruism. They're doing it to save themselves. I'm doing the same thing. And I feel like if white folks are trying to do it to help other people, that's all nice and good, but it's also probably the wrong motivation. And we need to recognize it as a threat to us as well.
Yeah, that's really why I wanted to bring it up for the listeners. Is it really, that was a great story that helped me realize, you know, a lot of, because I'm part of like the socially responsible business movement, the whole B Corp movement. And a lot of what we sort of tell ourselves is, oh, we need to help these folks sort of like raise themselves up to the standards of like to good standards. But it's again, it comes from like a paternalistic, oh, these poor folks type worldview instead of what are we doing to uphold white supremacy instead. So
right, absolutely. And I think if with a change in that mentality, which is by necessity, I mean, it does require a much more deliberate and somewhat slower process. But, you know, you're already, I mean, when you even think about socially responsible business practices, you're already willing to say, by definition, that your capable of and willing to think about some stuff that your typical business does not have to think about. So you're already like part of the way down that road, right? You're already saying, hey, we're going to prioritize a certain set of things that are not just about return to shareholders or investors or profit. Like, you know, you have a whole different set of principles under that corporate model. So by definition, you're saying you're about some deeper things. And all that I think those of us who focus on undoing white supremacy are saying is, cool. Well, part of making that really effective is taking that time to get to know and build trust and build relationship with the communities where you want to operate in a way that's going to allow that relationship to be longstanding and really transformative, as opposed to this sort of, transitional or tertiary kind of thing, which oftentimes is what happens.
What is your thought on, I've got some pushback from folks, other white people primarily, about calling it white supremacy. And what is your thoughts? They're like, why not white dominance or white or racism? Or what's your thoughts on that whole debate?
Right. I mean, I use a lot of different terms sort of interchangeably because I want us to understand the reason I insist on saying white supremacy as often as I do. And there are times I say white dominance. There are times I say white hegemony, but hegemony is sort of a really academic-y kind of term. So, you know, it has its problems too. The reason I want to say white supremacy, though, instead of say just racism, is it seems to me it's sort of the distinction between, like, if you think you go to the grocery and, you know, you think about, okay, well, let's say I want to buy a soda, right? And every grocery chain, right, has like a generic brand. You always get a generic brand of soda. And, but let's be honest, like Coca-Cola is the dominant brand with the most market share by far, right? And so I feel like white supremacy is that relative to this generic term racism. Like racism generically could mean, theoretically, anytime that a group of people feels superior to other people and treats them in a subordinate way on the basis of race, you know, theoretically that could be anybody doing anything to anyone or believing in the superiority of their own group and the inferiority of another. But in practice, you know, at an operational level, the only operative form of racism, certainly in the West, and I would say the dominant form on the planet, is white supremacy. So it's sort of like saying, it's also like sexism versus misogyny or patriarchy, right? Like sexism is generic, patriarchy, misogyny are really specific. So I think the more specific we can be, the better. And yeah, I know there will be people who say, well, you know, for them, white supremacy means Nazis and the Klan and all this. Okay, fine. Well, then we have a chance to have a conversation about that and have a conversation about the continuum of white supremacy. Yes, there is the, you know, clearly fascist, authoritarian, totalitarian end of white supremacy, which is represented maybe by the notion of the white ethno-state and all the folk, you know, the Unite the Right, Charlottesville folks and what they're fighting for and what David Duke's fighting for. And then there's, you know, the much more lower level, but still significant white supremacy of, you know, racial profiling or zoning restrictions or, you know, or just the lack of public transportation in large urban areas or, you know, limits on how those buses run. And, you know, that's not the same as Nazis, but it has a real effect on opportunity structures. We need to understand all of that as part of a continuum and understand racism / white supremacy as a continuum of awfulness.
And I think you take a great stance that I have not yet taken around, you actually engage actual Nazis and white supremacists. I'm mostly focused on progressive white people who think they're not racist. But
I don't engage too much, but
right. Well, I just mean like, you know, you actually call them out on Twitter and like, you know, write articles about, so it's more of like, I'm just curious, like how do you see, like, it's really valuable, I think, to have someone standing up to that. And also, like, do you see it as more of like someone needs to stand up to these folks, or like, what's your kind of strategy with like actual white supremacists?
Yeah, I don't know if there's a real conscious strategy. I will say that I go back and forth on how I feel about it because on the one hand, you know, one of the reasons that I got away from, I mean, I should actually back up. When I started, you know, when I got out of college and I did the work against David Duke, my initial sort of foray into large-scale anti-racism work, other than the South Africa stuff in college, was confronting this overt Nazi white supremacist who was running for office. And so part of that job involved. I had to read everything David Duke up to that point had ever written. I had to investigate all of these connections between him and these other Nazis and all of what that meant and all of what their arguments were. And there did come a point after doing that for like 2 years that I couldn't do it anymore. It was making me physically ill. It was emotionally wrecking me. And I also had a feeling that it was important to move away from fighting Nazis and deal with the more day-to-day institutional racism and white supremacy that you could see in places like New Orleans that wasn't about Nazis, that was there before Duke came on the scene and was going to be there after he faded from the scene. So I actually moved away from dealing with the Klan, Nazi, overt white supremacist stuff for many, many, many years. And I still think that the institutional and structural stuff is the most important stuff. And that is what I do 90% of the time. My speeches are very rarely about the white supremacist movement or Nazis. My articles are only every now and then about them. My books have not been about them, even though I've obviously talked about, some of the work I've done in White Like Me in that book. But yeah, my social media stuff is sometimes going to have that stuff in it because we are living in an era where this overt hardcore edge of white supremacist and Nazi activity and white nationalism is becoming more prominent and more normative than it was 10 and 15 and 20 and 25 years ago. And I do think one of the mistakes that we made, and I'm using we in a broad sense here, I always knew it was a mistake, but I had a hard time convincing other people. There were a lot of folks in 90, 91, 92, when the Duke stuff was going on, whose opinion was, we don't want to take these people's arguments seriously enough to respond to them. They're obviously Nazis. Let's just call them Nazis and be done with it. Well, in 1990 and 91, that might have been enough to keep Duke from winning those elections, although I should point out, not by much. He got the majority of white votes in both of those campaigns. But that's not a long-term strategy for defeating resurgent white nationalism. You can call people Nazi, and maybe for a while that'll make somebody go, oh, well, gosh, I probably shouldn't vote for that guy, even though I agree with like 80% of his politics, which I think some people probably felt that way. But if you're trying to keep a movement from growing, you are going to have to get into you're going to have to respond to the propaganda, especially in an internet age. And I think none of us saw the internet coming in 1991 this way. None of us saw the ubiquity of social media, but the white supremacists knew before the anti-racists did about the usefulness and the utility of these technologies. And David Duke and Stormfront and all these folks, white supremacists, were online doing stuff when the rest of us were still sending faxes around. Like literally they were way ahead, and they knew this was a way to spread their message. And because you had anti-racist groups that didn't want to engage, no, we're not going to respond to what they say about immigration, or we're not going to respond to what they say about race and IQ, or we're not going to respond to what they say about Jews and about the Holocaust not being real because we don't want to give credibility to their arguments. The problem is, in an internet age, like it or not, if you don't respond to that bullshit, it will spread because people will assume it's unrebuttable. That may be an intellectually bankrupt argument, but people fall prey to it. So I do feel that every now and then we have to get in there and mix it up and respond to this stuff, not because it's going to flip a Nazi. Like no Nazi is going to read anything I write and be like, oh, holy shit, I'm totally wrong about the Jews. Or, oh my God, I'm totally wrong about race and crime. Or no, you're not going to convert people like that. The only way those people flip is because they have some personal epiphany and personal experience that brings them out of it. But it is a way to inoculate other people, right? If you've got young people who are getting radicalized online because they're seeing this racist propaganda, at least if you've got some anti-racist propaganda, using that term propaganda now in the positive, not negative sense, at least they got a chance of maybe seeing that. And maybe, worst case scenario, they just don't know what to think and they just say, screw it, I'm gonna go play video games. Or screw it, I'm gonna go, just do Snapchat videos. But at the best, maybe they'll look at the arguments and they'll decide these Nazis are wrong. Right now, we got a lot of uncontested Nazi shit that's being sent around the internet, and a lot of anti-racists who think we don't want to elevate that. We don't want to give them a platform by responding to it. Well, they've got a platform. They've got their own websites. They've got their own chat rooms. They've already got a platform. The question is, what are we doing to help inoculate a new generation of potential anti-racist? And I just don't think we're doing enough.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I would support the idea of like white people standing up to white supremacists, because it's not people of color's duty to stand up to them.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Let's be clear. Like black and brown folks don't need to be doing that at all unless they just really, really want to. I know, there are people who do. Daryl Lamont Jenkins, who's somebody I've known for many, many years, who does, he does Antifa work, and he does a lot of the research work, One People's Project, around unmasking white supremacists and Nazis. I mean, he's an incredible guy, and he'll mix it up with folks, but I certainly would not call on black and brown folks to take on the bulk of that work. That's white folks' work for sure. So
in the sort of the scope of all the things you're working on, is there anything that's particularly exciting or energizing you right now?
It's hard to say. I mean, I go through these periods. I went through a period, like a lot of people, I think, right after the election in 2016, of just, somewhat manic panic about, well, what's the proper thing to do now, right? Like, what do I want to work on? And I started doing my podcast, and it's been rewarding and I think great in some ways. And I've been able to elevate the voices of some really incredible educators and activists and give them a chance to reach some people with some of the great work they're doing. So that excites me. But at the same time, like, we're all sort of, I think, experimenting a little bit with what's going to be the most effective approach for this particular moment. And I don't think we have figured it out. I think the right is, and I mean, when I say the right, I mean everything from the far, far, far right over to just sort of the mainstream Republican right and everything in between. I think they're far ahead of progressive and left and radical folk when it comes to the use of YouTube, and it comes to the use of social media, and it comes to the use of just a number of new technologies in terms of ways of reaching people. And so I think we've got to get a lot better at that. One of the problems with those of us on the left that I think is really critical, and this is one thing I'm working on, and I'm working on a new book. I got a couple of new book ideas, and one of the central premises that I'm working under for these books is that we've got to get better at the narrative piece of this. I think a lot of people on the left and liberal and progressive folks tend to place an inordinate amount of faith in the power of pure reason to carry the day. Like this idea that, well, if people just see the facts and the truth, right, then we'll win because people care about that. Well, it'd be great if people did, but the research on brain science, the cognitive development research, the brain science research, neuroscience says that we're not actually usually making our decisions or coming to our politics based on reason, logic, or facts. That whether you're on the left or the right, you have some preconceived notions that come from your experiences, and then you tend to go look for evidence to fill in the gaps of your preconceived notions. We have epistemic closure. We close ourselves off to this larger universe of information. We have confirmation bias. These are human frailties. The thing that actually affects people, though, and can move them from place one to place two, and maybe get people thinking in different ways, is the narrative piece, is the storytelling piece. It's not the facts, the figures, the studies, but it's the narrative, it's the storytelling. I think the right is really good at storytelling. Donald Trump is a master storyteller. He's actually really good at, and he, the stories he tells are bullshit, but he's very good at it. Ronald Reagan was brilliant at telling stories. Ronald Reagan, in part, is able to gain support in 1980 by telling stories that he started telling in 1976 when he ran for president the first time about, welfare queens and designer jeans driving Cadillacs to the welfare office to pick up their check in places like Chicago, or talking about, strapping young bucks buying T-bone steaks with food stamps. And none of these stories were true. I mean, he was fabricating these stories, but they were really effective because they spoke to this sort of preconceived notion of people about who these people over there, these grifters, these poor people, these poor black folks in particular were. And I think what we've done on the left is we tend to respond to that, not with stories of hardworking, low-income folks who work two jobs and are struggling to keep a roof over their head and are just amazing people fighting horrible odds. We tend to respond with data that says, well, you're wrong about poor people, and here's 30 pieces of evidence that say you're wrong. Now, don't get me wrong. I want us to know that evidence, and I've written pieces where I present that evidence. But at the end of the day, we have to capture the narrative. We have to tell the stories that are more effective and, more importantly, that are true, that can counter the stories that the right is telling. So what I'm excited about is, the opportunity to maybe use my podcast to do that, and also to write some books in the next couple of years that will focus on that. Because what I've discovered with White Like Me, which we've mentioned a couple of times so far, I mean, that book came out 15 years ago, and I'm working on a 15th anniversary edition right now of a rewrite in part. And one of the reasons is, I've done 7 books, and of the 7 books, 6 of them are very data driven, very fact driven. And I have people all the time that'll be like, oh, I really like that book Colorblind or Under the Affluence. Boy, that really helped me with my research paper. Or that really helped me last night. I was having a debate with my roommate. And I'm like, all right, whatever. It's not really why I wrote it, but cool. But White Like Me, because it's storytelling, because it's memoir, because I'm not necessarily hitting you over the head with a bunch of facts and data. I'm just saying, like, here are these stories. Here's how I interpret them. You can interpret them differently if you want, but just think about them. I think people are more open to it. It's less threatening. And people have written to me to say, that book actually changed my life in the sense that it changed the way that I think about my place in the world, or it changed the trajectory of my professional or academic career. Like, that's the kind of impact we need to be having. And I think sometimes we spend more time wrapped up in studying critical theory and sociology than we spend studying PR and marketing. And the right is really good at PR and marketing, and we've got to get better at that.
That's such a great insight. Yeah, I remember, like, you had Debbie Irving and Robin DiAngelo on your podcast, I believe. And I know Debbie's book was very powerful. It's just her whole story. So I would second your insight into that. And even Robin's book, even though Robin's book is analytical, she still tells stories about encounters that she's had and experiences that she's had. And I think that's what makes that book effective as well. Yeah. And you have to be an effective book to be top 100 overall on Amazon for a year and counting. Yeah.
I think I had that for 6 hours once. I never quite had Robin's success.
So, looking towards the future a little bit, who else, who's inspiring you, and what should listeners, who are other folks that should sort of be on the radar of listeners that you're inspired by?
Well, I'm inspired by, and have been for many, many years now, the young activists who are doing so much of the amazing work around police accountability and the movement for Black lives, as well as immigration rights movements. Young people from places like Tucson that led the fight to get Mexican American studies restored in the Tucson Unified School District, or have fought that fight after the state tried to get rid of it. The folks who were, doing the work around the DREAM Act and really progressive, humane immigration reform. The vast majority of these young folks, they are young. They're teenagers. A lot of them, particularly on the immigration debate, young undocumented folks who know that they are facing potential retribution and even deportation in some cases for raising their voice over the last decade on those issues, but doing it anyway. I'm obviously very inspired by some of the writing and emerging scholarship that has been coming out in the last couple of years. The fact that, in the last, just last few years, putting aside Robin DiAngelo for a minute, whose book was a bestseller and has been off and on since it came out, beginning, the fact that that was such a big and influential book. And it's a thick, really ponderous volume. It's the kind of thing, 10 years ago, nobody's going to buy that book except for those of us who already really loved reading about race and were sort of, into that stuff. But it did really, really well. Or the fact that Carol Anderson's book, White Rage, she's a professor at Emory University in Atlanta. The fact that that book has done so well, that these things are influential. The fact that theories of intersectionality that Kim Crenshaw, who's a dear friend and colleague, started talking about literally 30 years ago, and it was like screaming into a forest where you're the only one there for a while, and then all of a sudden this term, even though I think it's, and she would agree, we've talked about this, it's been misappropriated and misapplied, and it's not always well understood, but just the fact that we're talking about the intersectionality between race and gender, class, sexuality, all of these things, says that something is happening, and that there has been some positive effect of the scholarship and the activism and the educational consciousness raising work that we have all been engaged in. At the same time, and it's related to that, the thing that scares me is that I feel that we've done a good job of moving the conversation on some of these things, so much so that, terms like white privilege are nowadays, people know what, they respond to that term without wondering, wait, what are you talking about? They might not respond well, they might respond hostile, but at least they've heard it. The problem is we've moved the conversation in that direction, but I'm not sure that we were prepared fully for the backlash that was going to come, right? And just as one really good example of this, I remember, and it still happens, but it's certainly 10, 15, 20 years ago, whenever I would go and speak, if I was speaking to like a company or if I was speaking to, any group that wasn't really like overtly left or progressive, the argument you'd always hear made, and I've heard it, within the last month by some people that I was at an event with, was, we need to make the business case for diversity and the business case for equity. And the business case is basically, we've got to, whether it's increasing market share of our company or whether it's, but the big one was always, well, in 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, the country's going to be half white, half people of color. So we got to have all hands on deck for a working economy. We got to have greater equity or else we're just not going to survive. We're not going to have enough people paying into Social Security. All of this, by the way, is true. This sort of practical case for equity in society based on demographic change, it's all very accurate. But what we're learning is, and we weren't prepared for this and we didn't think it through, is that when white people hear that they're going to be the minority or that they're no longer going to be the absolute majority, because we're not really going to be the minority, we're going to be the plurality, right? But when we're no longer going to be hegemonic, instead of encouraging white folks to join in solidarity with other people, what ends up happening, we're learning, is that white folks get really nervous. Imagine that, right? Because when you're used to dominance and you're used to hegemony, pluralism does feel like oppression, as opposed to some people. So they double down on immigration restrictions. They double down on the wall, right? They double down on that. So I think we've effectively moved the conversation. That is inspiring. What we haven't done is prepare for some of the growing pains that has brought forward. The old saying was, being white means never having to think about it. That was true for most of American history. In the last 10 years, white folks are thinking about it. And the ways in which they're thinking about it are not always helpful. And so we've got to figure out ways to respond to that.
Love that analysis. And in terms of the listeners and how they can support you, what do you need right now, and how can people help you grow this next economy?
Well, I think for me, I've been very fortunate to be able to, do my work on the road and lecture around the country for 25 years. I want to continue doing that. And so obviously, if there are folks who are listening to the show who have a need for a seminar, a speaker, someone to come in and do a training either alone or in concert with someone else, preferably do any of that, of course, and folks can reach out to me at timwise.org. And even though I don't update that site that much anymore, there is contact information there. I'm also on Twitter at Tim Jacob Wise, and I'm on Facebook, same thing at Tim Jacob Wise. You can find me the same way there. In addition to that, I'm really trying, however, as much as I enjoy going on the road, I'm also, I started doing that when I was 26. I'm going to be 51 in October. I would like to not have to travel quite as much. And one of the ways to do that is I really do want to grow the sort of media impact through the podcast, and not just for myself. The whole purpose of my podcast, Speak Out with Tim Wise, is really to try to give voice to other people who maybe don't have the following or the prominence that I have. Maybe I've been very fortunate in part because I'm a white, straight, cisgendered male with the college education and now at least sort of upper middle class and relatively comfortable. I'm therefore, my voice carries, and privilege has a lot to do with that. But there are a lot of amazing activists and scholars, disproportionately of color, who maybe haven't had the same amount of shine placed on them as I've had placed on me. I want to be able to amplify their voices and help empower them. So the way that people can support me, but support me in a way that also supports the amplification of those voices is by supporting some of that work on the podcast. And folks can do that on my patreon.com page, which is Speak Out with Tim Wise. They can do that at speakoutnow.org, which is the nonprofit speakers agency and educational group that books my engagements. There's a link on there where people can contribute to the podcast via PayPal. So anything like that, is going to help us continue to reach more people, not just with my voice, but the voices of people who I'm trying to bring to as much prominence and attention as I can.
Yeah, and I can throw enthusiastic support behind folks subscribing to the podcast. A brief aside, Tim, your intro music is by far the best podcast intro music I've ever heard.
Well, thank you. I'm very lucky that for years now I've had this friendship with Brother Ali, who is the incredible hip hop artist who does.
That's who did your intro?
That's Brother Ali, yeah. So I've used him. I mean, he's one of the just greatest people though I've ever met. Just a wonderful human being, an incredible artist, very well respected within the hip hop community. But he he actually he does the intro outro music for the podcast. That's the song Gather Round, which is a couple albums ago of his. It's a song from a couple albums back. And then he also does the outro music for my last 2 documentaries, which I did with the Media Education Foundation, one of which is called White Like Me. So it's an examination of privilege, somewhat autobiographical, but also scholarly for use in college classrooms. And then the latest one, The Great White Hoax, which is about Donald Trump and the politics of race and class. He does the outro music on both of those. I just basically got permission from him to use songs. I mean, he didn't write them special for me. There's songs that are his on his albums. And for Great White Hoax, we used one of his songs off his latest album, Before They Called You White. And it's an incredible song. He's an incredible artist. And I was really lucky that he, gave me permission to use the music.
Yeah, just one time when you do your podcast, you should start freestyling to the intro music. What do you think?
That would not be an idea at all. I don't think. I joke about in White Like Me that I was that kid in like 5th grade who knew all the words to the 14-minute version of Rapper's Delight, but that doesn't mean that you really want me to spit it. So I probably should keep my mouth quiet.
Fair enough. Knowing your limits, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Well, great, Tim. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. And once again, what was the website so folks can go and check out more about you?
Well, my website, which I haven't really been updating it, trying to migrate over to a different platform, but timwise.org is certainly where my contact info is. It's also where a bunch of archived articles and videos can be found. But I also have a page of my more recent essays at medium.com. If you search under my name, my Twitter handle is @TimJacobWise. Same thing at Facebook. You can find me there that way. And then speakoutnow.org, which is the nonprofit Speakers Bureau, an educational organization that books my engagements, but also hosts my podcast. And they just do a lot of great work. So if you go and look at speakoutnow.org, there's a lot of wonderful speakers, by the way, that if folks are interested in bringing speakers, we have about 100 or so people, probably 2/3 to 3/4 of whom are folks of color who talk about all kinds of incredible issues. So it's not just where you can find out more about my work, but you can find out more about a bunch of other great folks as well.
Great. Well, thanks so much again, Tim, and look forward to chatting again in the near future.
Next Economy Now is a production of Lift Economy. Lift is an impact consulting firm whose mission is to create, model, and share a locally self-reliant economy that works for the benefit of all life. To listen to all our past episodes or to share your thoughts about the show with us, visit www.lifteconomy.com/podcast. That's LIFT economy.com/podcast. You can also subscribe to this podcast through iTunes, Overcast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please take a moment to rate us on iTunes. It's really very helpful in allowing these ideas to reach a wider audience. Once again, thanks for listening.